Colleagues, good afternoon. We are resuming our session. And just to reorient ourselves before we suspend it, we were discussing the amendment of Mr. Genuis to delete a phrase in the motion, namely that the committee hold no fewer than 5 meetings. Is that the understanding of members? I don't see any objections. So with that, we have a speakers list right now that includes Mr. Chung and then Mr. Genuis. If colleagues are interested in being added to the speakers list, please raise your hand either virtually or in person. And we will give the floor.
Mr. Chair, I wanted to speak to the main motion after
the amendment?
The amendment, yes.
Okay, so you're going to go into standby mode for that. I'll mark that down. Thank you. Mr. Genuis, Ms. Landsman as well, on the amendment or on the main motion? On the amendment? Okay.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Sorry to interrupt the proceedings. I realized you asked the question just a moment ago, and I just wanted to clarify. We did, in fact, vote on the amendment proposed, I believe, and that we have voted that down, and we are now back on the main motion.
I'm advised that the committee had not voted on the amendment. If that's incorrect, so let's please clarify that. And I was not there for the last portion of the meeting, so that the advice I got is that the committee had in fact not yet voted on the amendments by Mr. Genuis.
No fewer than 5 meetings?
I don't think we had. I mean,
Let's just get clear. This is an important question, so let's clarify. And we'll suspend for a moment just to make sure that we're getting the right starting blocks before we start the discussion. One moment. Mr. Chung will stand by for the resumption of discussion on the main motion. Mr. Genuis on the amendment. Ms. Landsman on the amendment. Does anybody else wish to intervene at this point? Or if not, just keep raising your hands when you do wish to intervene. I'll keep an eye on the virtual list as well. Over to you, Mr. Genuis, please.
thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome back. I've been thinking a lot just about kind of the nature of the committee, the work we have to do in the context of just some of the things going on around the world. And I would like to propose a very specific adjournment motion right now. So that motion is that the debate be adjourned on this motion until the committee has completed its work on Ukraine. So if that's understood, I will proceed to speak on that adjournment motion.
And thank you, Mr. Genuis. And just to clarify, that's a non-dilatory motion because it has a condition attached to it?
Correct.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know there have been different levels of passion by different members and people asserting that there's no politics, allegedly, behind the sudden proposal that we sort of prioritize in the work of this committee the question of abortion. But I think the public will be well advised to note what's going on around the precinct more broadly. That is, and members of this committee probably know, may not, but certainly the people behind the table probably know well, the fact that many motions are being moved on the subject of abortion at many different committees across the precinct. It seems to have been the conclusion of the strategic minds from our friends across the way that having as much discussion about abortion at as many parliamentary committees as possible is a good idea. And to pretend that that is sort of not framed with politics in mind is a bit rich. It's not for me to say what other committees should study. Of course, other committees also have competing considerations. There are, perhaps there's a case to say there's a particular need at a committee. But I can only speak to the issue in front of us, which is the question of the agenda of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And my goal with this specific motion, with this specific adjournment motion, is to put into focus the question of whether we want this committee to prioritize a discussion of the issue of abortion, or whether we want this committee to prioritize a discussion of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That is the choice. And I think in a context where we have one Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as many other committees in this place. There was a Status of Women Committee, there was a Justice Committee, there's a Public Safety Committee, there's an International Human Rights Committee, and in fact, one member already spoke about the fact that she had brought a motion to that other committee. And in the past, when we've had issues specifically around human rights, the argument has been made by some members that, that's what we have the subcommittee for. That is the goal of the subcommittee. But I just think about the sort of breadth of issues that we're dealing with in the world. I mean, there's of course the question of Taiwan. There's of course the question of vaccine equity. But there is in particular the invasion of Ukraine that I think it is fair to say has really seized the attention and concern of Canadians from all walks of life. I know I'm hearing it significantly within my constituency. My riding is home to a large Ukrainian diaspora, and I think people have, up till now, been following the very serious, the very nonpartisan, and the very engaging work that had been done by this committee up till then. And I think on Ukraine there have been some differences in terms of the recommended approach of the parties. That is, there have been times when we've been critical of the government, and there's been things back and forth. But generally, our tone has been, in the context of the foreign invasion, to try to keep the discussion focused on the issues and substantive, and that is befitting the dignity and seriousness which we would expect from the Canadian Foreign Affairs Committee. And I'll say, as we sort of contemplate this choice about what we prioritize and whether we prioritize the Russian invasion of Ukraine as being a central issue of importance, that we don't sell ourselves short as a Foreign Affairs Committee either. Sometimes there is the tendency for members of Parliament to fail to fully appreciate just how important our role is. We have the potential as the Canadian Foreign Affairs Committee to drive discussion at this critical time in global affairs, when I believe for the first time since the Second World War, we have one sovereign state invading another, and in Europe, and the implications for global security, for our own security. And this has been reemphasized regularly by government ministers, but of course by members of this committee and by members of all parties. And the context of the Ukraine study is one in which we said, let's begin looking at the issue of Ukraine, but let's do it in an open-ended way without prescribing a certain number of meetings. And let's be open to schedule additional meetings as new information comes online. And I believe it was Ms. Bendayan who had initially proposed that, and this was, I think, a very good idea. It was prior to, well, I shouldn't say prior to the invasion, because of course the invasion really started in 2014, but it was prior to the escalation of the invasion that we saw in February. We saw beginning in February of this year. So we started holding hearings on this, and I think we began hearing very compelling testimony from various officials that highlighted what we needed to do, that highlighted the challenges in front of us, spoke about Minister Jolie's recent travel to Europe. This was prior to the invasion, about issues around Operation Unifier, the commitment at the time in January to the renewal of Operation Unifier, significant investments that were being considered around humanitarian assistance. And I recall that prior to the invasion, really our focus had been making the case for tougher sanctions, that targeted sanctions would play a critically important deterrent role. And also, we were making the case for energy security even then. And of course, the discussion around energy security has increased more. And I think it's, again, something that this committee should take up as part of its consideration around the issue of Ukraine. But the proposals around sanctions, around lethal weapon support, around ongoing training and other forms of assistance to Ukraine, I think needed to be focused on this question of deterrence. The best way to defeat an invader is to deter them in the first place, obviously, right? Is to establish the conditions where the Putin regime would have made the calculation that they were better off not interfering. And we need to take very serious stock of the fact that this was a failure of deterrence. And if you look historically at the times when we've been drawn into major wars, it has, I think, generally, I'd be careful about general, but it has often been tied into some kind of a failure of deterrence. When aggressors perceive that they will not be resisted in their gradual efforts to occupy more and more and more territory. So why did we allow the conditions to be established such that there was this failure of deterrence in the context of the invasion of Ukraine? I think we have to look back at the fact that right back to 2015, and maybe we should have been studying the issue of Ukraine in this committee even then. And I was not a permanent member of this committee as of 2015, 2016. I think maybe there were some of the same members, but I was subbing quite a bit at the time. And we raised the issue around the cutting off of access to radar stat image sharing. That following the 2014 invasion, the government of Stephen Harper had put in place a system of image and information sharing coming out of radar stat, and this was provided important strategic resources to Ukraine, but it also provided an important an important expression of solidarity, of our commitment to doing all we could to support and enable the Ukrainians. I traveled to Ukraine in 2016, and to see the sense of hope that came out of the fact that they were getting weapons, they were acquiring resources, they felt that their army was much better prepared than it had been 2 years before. And I know that preparation and readiness and fighting continued and of course continues to this day. But the radar stat technology played an important role, and it was never really explained why the new government led by Prime Minister Trudeau, made the choice of no longer sharing that critical information. It was also, I think, around that time, there was the context of obvious internal debate within the government caucus over the issue of Magnitsky sanctions. Magnitsky sanctions really are a top ask, were and continue to be a top area of focus for the Ukrainian community, and also for the Russian dissident community, and pushing this message of the need to have Magnitsky sanctions to be able to target those that are involved in gross violations of human rights. And so this was an important measure that was proposed. And at the time, the foreign minister Stéphane Dion and the Liberal government gave every indication of not being keen on the Magnitsky sanctions regime. But there was, in the end, the House of Commons unanimously adopted the Magnitsky Act, which was, I think, an important step forward. But it was not used. There have been plenty of cases, I think, right up to the end of February, when the kind of further invasion took place, when Conservatives were asking about specific individuals that were involved in human rights abuses in Russia and that were involved in acts of aggression against Ukraine, and those individuals were not being sanctioned. And I think it underlines the importance of the Ukraine study and the importance of the work of this committee, that in the context of the Ukraine issue, we were able to put forward specific names of individuals. And one way that we framed it was around Navalny's list. Alexei Navalny, the important Russian opposition figure, had put forward a list of individuals who he thought should be sanctioned. We raised some of those names at this committee, and eventually some of those individuals were sanctioned. And in fact, the Prime Minister, when he sanctioned them, cited specifically the fact that they were on Navalny's list. He didn't specifically cite the work of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but it does underline just how important it is that we do put these things onto the agenda and put out there the fact that these are that we have opinions as people, as legislators who work on this committee, and that oftentimes when we put those issues forward, they do shape the response of government and the response of ministers. But notwithstanding the fact that I think that we were pleased to see some of that movement on some of the sanctioning of individuals that were brought up in this committee, that movement didn't happen until after February 23rd. After I believe it was the 23rd. I might be off by a day or two. But it didn't happen until after February 23rd. And the advice that we had received, and I know Marcus Kolga and Bill Browder and others appeared before this committee to speak about the importance of sanctions and to, in particular, help us understand the deterrent effect that could come about as a result of those sanctions. We were given this sense that there's, and this is where Navalny's list comes in as well, that there are people around Vladimir Putin who are responsible for taking and investing the regime's money, and that in particular Mr. Putin is focused on his own interests, his own financial interests, and his own preservation and enhancement of power. So that striking hard in advance, not militarily, of course, but with sanctioning, totally justified on the basis of past acts of aggression and human rights abuses, striking in advance would have, I think, played that important role in sending a deterrent message. So we look back at some of these actions ahead of February of last year, the cutting off of the sharing of RadarSat images, the failure to make better use of the Magnitsky Act, the failure to sanction individuals that were responsible for investing the regime's personal wealth. I think had we taken those steps, we could have played a stronger role in deterrence. We can be proud of the role Canada played in the immediate aftermath of the initial invasion of Crimea in 2014. I think as a key player, member of various international organizations, Canada was able to pull countries towards a stronger position, and that was when Russia was expelled from the G8, and that was really the first time that Russia felt consequences of that significance. We'd seen human rights abuses, of course, in Chechnya, aggressive action in Georgia. We've seen other instances of this, but it was really Canadian leadership that played a big role in pushing for that strengthened, sharpened global response, which followed the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And that was the point at which we have to understand the violation of Russia's commitment under the Budapest Memorandum, a clear promise on committing to Ukraine's territorial integrity. And I think, part of the value of studying this and of going back in our look at it, looking at the present, looking forward, but also looking back at kind of where we've been since Ukrainian independence, is to counter some of that misinformation that we often see out there in the context of this invasion. It is important to acknowledge right out of the gate that whatever some people may try to say about, okay, whose territory, what, when, the Russian Federation committed to defending the territorial integrity of Ukraine based on its boundaries prior to 2014, which are still its internationally recognized boundaries. But I think after 2015, Canada, at least in the initial phase, certainly Canada was not as aggressive. It was not as pointed, and there are certain obvious instances, such as the ones I've mentioned, where we eased off the kind of pressure that had been there. And I think that informed the failure of deterrence that got us to the point where we are now, where the kind of trajectory post 2014 was a strong response from the rest of the world, and then kind of a gradual easing off. And that happened differently in some countries as opposed to others. But there was a sense that even though the conflict was ongoing, and even though Russia continued to be occupying sovereign Ukrainian territory and continued during that period to be committing gross violations of human rights against the Ukrainian people, there was, I think, in some countries, this kind of easing off of the pressure, this kind of forgetting that things were actually continuing to go on. In the few months leading up to this invasion itself, and I think it was very clear to members of Parliament that this was coming. I believe that obviously the government was aware of the risks, and they spoke directly about it when we had officials come before the committee. Officials told us, quote, "The mobilization of Russian military forces in and around Ukraine continues with no sign of de-escalation. The situation remains unpredictable, and President Putin's military intentions remain unclear. We're working closely with our allies and partners to find a diplomatic solution to the military conflict by developing multiple strong deterrents." So this was the stated policy commitment from Global Affairs, and that was the testimony we heard at this committee prior to the invasion. And many of the questions were specifically building off that commitment around deterrence. How do we strengthen our deterrence? How do we strengthen our position in relation to the need for deterring that aggression? So this was where we were at that time, and we heard from other witnesses again calling for those sanctions, calling specifically for the targeting of those that were around the regime. I should note as well, and one of the issues that we've dealt with at the committee is misinformation in the form of RT, and some of the efforts of the Russian Federation to project information, disinformation here about what was happening before, what was happening in the context of the invasion and since. So this is notable in that there are inconsistencies in terms of the approach we've taken. Sorry.
Sir Genius, let me pause you for One moment, we've got a point of order. Mr. Oliphant, please.
I'm just wondering if there is a speakers list, which would be a point of order, and if there is, it might alleviate the members' gymnastics of trying to extend this conversation to what some might consider to be a filibuster, going on issues of RT when we are talking about another R, which is reproductive technologies as well as capacity for that. But if there is a speakers list, it might give him a little break and he won't have to keep going through that list.
Mr. Oliphant, thank you. We'll treat that as a point of order just to refresh the committee who is currently on that list. It is Mr. Genuis who's got the floor. It's yourself, Madame Bandayan, and Mr. Duncan at the moment. If anybody else wishes to be added, please use, Ms. Landsman, use the raised hand feature online or signal the clerk or myself if you're in the room. And with that, back to Mr. Genuis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we need to be clear about the topic that's in front of us. We're debating the agenda of the committee, and we're debating.
Mr. Chair, we are actually not debating the
that would be a point.
agenda of the committee. That is not what we're doing. We're actually debating a motion which is with respect to an amendment on another motion. We are not in any way debating the agenda of this committee. That is work that should be done in the future once some of the intentions are known, but it is simply not a debate about the agenda of the committee, and that seems to be the fundamental misunderstanding.
I'll treat that as a point that straddles a point of order and a point of debate because it's partially about what the committee will do, but it isn't about the plenary set of issues before the committee. Mr. Genuis, if you could just stick to
thank you, Mr.
the
Chair.
relevance as much as you can.
I thank Mr. Oliphant for his suggestions, but I do maintain the view that this is a motion. I mean, it's an adjournment motion in the context of an amendment on a motion, but the purpose of moving the original motion was very much about setting the agenda of the committee. It did so with some level of specificity. It didn't prescribe on which dates those meetings would take place, but it said that the committee should proceed with a study on a particular issue. That issue, that issue substantially was about abortion as well as some other things. And the context for the Liberals wanting to make the focus of discussion at the Foreign Affairs Committee of Canada abortion, when we have the invasion of Ukraine, we have threats to Taiwan, we have various other challenges around the world. The Liberals' desire to reopen that debate in the context of the Foreign Affairs Committee specifically, and let's acknowledge a whole bunch of other committees, is a question fundamentally of the agenda of the committee. And so what I'm doing is I'm putting forward an adjournment motion that says let's focus our attention for the time being on the earth-shattering events that are taking place in Ukraine, the implications for women and men there and around the world. And I do think it's important to acknowledge that before perhaps the direction from PMO came in to say, look, we drop everything. We want to be talking about abortion at every committee we can. Before that direction may have come in, Liberal members were very pointed in talking about just how urgently attending to the issue for Ukraine was. I might even quote remarks by Dr. Fry, who said on February 14th, with the prescience to make these comments prior to the invasion, prior to the further invasion, I should say. She said, I believe this was in this committee, we are seeing a global movement to get rid of democracy. We know that Taiwan and Ukraine are democratic. We see Russia doing what it's doing in Ukraine, and we see China taking steps against Hong Kong and Taiwan. They are invading airspace, moving very close to naval lines, etc. Is your sense that this is part of a joint action to get rid of democracy in the two major regions, Europe and the Asia Pacific? And then she said again, are we concerned about the big picture, that long-range plan to rid the world of democratic institutions and democratic nations? So if members agree that this is part of a strategic effort to make the world less safe for democracy, and I am inclined to generally agree with Dr. Fry's perspective, then my goodness, folks, we are the Foreign Affairs Committee. This is what we should be very much seized with. We should be seized with the urgency of what's going on. The parliamentary secretary here, Mr. Oliphant, said, I want to begin by just, this is April 5th, I want to begin by just giving the context in which this debate is happening. It has been more than a month since President Putin chose to unleash war on Ukraine. With every day that passes, the number of civilians, including children, killed and wounded continues to climb. We have witnessed Russian attacks on apartment buildings, public squares, theaters, and maternity hospitals. In addition, recent reports and images of what Russian forces carried out in Bucha are horrifying, and they are deeply shameful. Let me be clear, we believe that this amounts to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and we are committed to holding President Putin and those supporting him accountable for these actions. Mr. Oliphant said at the time that we were witnessing war crimes and crimes against humanity. But since then, I believe it was since then, I can't remember the exact date on which Ms. McPherson's motion came forward, but since then the House has recognized that Russian forces are committing genocide in Ukraine. So we have, if you take just the words of Liberal members, and I think Conservatives were saying some of these things a little bit earlier in the process, but if you take just what in recent days we've heard from Liberal members, they are saying war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide as part of an effort to eradicate democracy and democratic institutions. That is the account being given by Liberal members in terms of where we are and where we might be going. And there are other committees in this place, but I would say, as the one Foreign Affairs Committee, that we have a responsibility to say, let's take this issue on in a serious way, and let's be engaged with continuing emergence of events. Let's be engaged with continuing developments as things go forward. I made the point, and I think many members have as well, that there is what is happening in Ukraine, but there is also what the events in Ukraine mean for the rest of the world. The kind of precedent-setting issues around this happening. Russia and China are very, very different states in many respects, but they are both governed by revisionist leaders who do not support the idea of an international rules-based order. They believe that nations should be able to exercise dominance and power if they have that power to exercise within their self-determined sphere of influence. And the position of Canada and its allies has been to assert that that the relations among nations should be governed by rules, should be governed by a set of principles and mechanisms of arbitration, so that when nations have disputes, they don't need to resort to violence as the only way of mediating those disputes. That is the core idea of a rules-based international order, and it's one that makes everybody everywhere better off. And so in invading Ukraine, the Putin regime is trying to upend that international rules-based order. And that order only exists if it is defended and protected, and if there are consequences for those that violate it. Otherwise, nations will seize on this precedent and try to go further. And we have a separate study happening at this committee on the issue of Taiwan, but I think we always sort of understood that there was a kind of a notional linkage between these issues, that what happened in Ukraine, what happens in Ukraine has implications for Taiwan. It has implications for other nations that might be a victim of subsequent aggression. If we allow the disregard of the principles of law and order in international affairs, and we allow them to be substituted with the rule of force, then the consequences will be extremely dire. But nonetheless, the invasion happened, and I think some people were very much surprised by the nature and scale of it. Although I think there was significant expectation of some kind of aggression by Russian forces against Ukraine, and the goal, I think one core goal we have to identify, and I think this has come out in some of the testimony that we've heard already very well, is the desire to bolster Putin's popularity at home. Concerns about his declining popularity prior to the invasion, and his desire to try to energize his image. And we saw similar efforts by this regime before, going back to really horrific violence that Vladimir Putin was responsible for in Chechnya, and these acts of violence, appeared to create a kind of short-term rally around the flag impression, and it then allowed and there was not. In some of these early instances, a significant response from the rest of the world. I think it looks like the Putin regime has, in a certain sense, miscalculated in terms of the level of strength and severity of the response from Ukraine and the effectiveness of the response from the rest of the world. The situation has been the initial stated war aim of effectively demilitarizing the entire country, and I think what a lot of people expected, with what our witnesses talked about, was the desire of the Putin regime to install a puppet government of some sort. That doesn't look like it has any chance of succeeding. And I just remember in the first week of the war, regularly checking the Kiev hashtag to see, okay, what's is the capital going to fall? What's the situation looking like? And Ukrainians just heroically resisted, and what was I think planned to be quick is obviously continuing, and Ukrainians deserve a huge amount of credit for their heroic resistance. The international community has stepped up in various ways, the conservative position in response to that initial invasion was to say that we are supportive of the steps that the government has taken to date, and we continue to be supportive of the steps that have been taken, and we've also continued to put ideas forward for additional steps, and we've continued to say that that we need to, in the appropriate way at the appropriate time, certainly take note of how not strong enough or forceful enough action prior to the invasion likely put us in a position of greater vulnerability. So, going forward, the issues that we need to look at in terms of how we support Ukraine, and I think we could find witnesses that would support our efforts on all of these fronts. There is an urgent need for more weapons, for more lethal weapons that will effectively protect Ukrainians and try to support the ongoing heroic resistance. Again, more weapons earlier, but better late than never. And this continues to be a key ask. We had the pleasure of hearing from the ambassador-designate here from Ukraine, talking about the urgent need of more weapons. And I think what we could do as a committee is we could hear that testimony. We could hear specifically from those with expertise in weaponry and hardware to be able to then come back and make concrete recommendations to the government around the steps that we should take. And I'm always in favor of parliamentary committees grabbing their role and being very substantive and specific in recommendations. I think sometimes the temptation for committees is to kind of take the easy way out and say, government should study such and such an issue. You know, committee's just been through a detailed study of an issue, and it says, well, it looks like we should do such and such, but we're not going to actually recommend that the government do such and such a thing. We're going to recommend that the government do further study on that particular point. And my view is that that's usually kind of a missed opportunity for the committee members to take their collective knowledge and expertise and build on that, and to go from a recommendation for further study to actually provide those specifics. So I think when it comes to just this vital need for lethal weaponry, we can go further in hearing more testimony and being specific. The issue I am hearing about over and over again in my riding with respect to how we can support Ukraine is the issue of energy security and recognizing the role that Canadian energy can play in displacing Russian gas, Russian energy products that are going into Europe. The Russian economy is heavily dependent on the export of natural resources. Europe is number one. Europe receives a majority of Russian gas, Russian oil products. Russia is also a significant exporter of coal, some of which goes to our democratic partners in the Indo-Pacific region, like South Korea. So Canada, as a nation with in many ways a very different economy from Russia, but also a natural resource producing country, we have an immense amount of potential to see a critical role that we can play in the context of supporting Ukraine and its fight, is to enable our democratic partners to impose tougher energy-related sanctions against the Putin regime. And we can enable them to do that by exporting more of our oil and gas products to Europe and to the Asia Pacific. And we have these long debates about pipelines and process in this country, and I think those are important conversations, but we have to just proceed with such a recognition of the urgency here that the factors we kind of weigh out when we're making these decisions. Yes, we have to take into consideration the economic effects on jobs and opportunity, issues of engaging Indigenous communities that are affected by natural resource projects, many of whom are supportive of those projects, as well as environmental impacts. But this global security dimension has, I think, not been a sufficient part of the discussion up until now, and it needs to be, I think, part of the discussion to a much greater extent going forward, saying how do we, recognizing the crisis that we're in, how do we move quickly? And the interesting thing is to see the government's response and how it's shifted over time. I think initially when we were raising these energy security issues, and my colleague Mr. Chong had a motion before the House right away after the invasion that flagged energy security as being a key piece of this, and the government sadly didn't support that motion. But initially the government was saying, no, the alternative is renewables, or the alternative is renewables. And I guess my response to that would be to just say the response is everything. The alternative is everything. When Europe is continuing to effectively allow the Russian economy to function because of their own need for energy products, and when we can displace those energy products through our own exports, we have a crucial role to play, and it has a significant impact, and it's one that just requires a recognition of the urgency, such that we can't wait for the development of new technologies. No one's against new renewable technologies, but the urgency of the situation requires us to take an all of the above approach. And look, it's good for the environment. for Canada to produce and export more of its clean, relatively cleanly produced energy products as an alternative to Russian exports. If we're able, in particular, for example, to provide alternatives in the Indo-Pacific region through the export of Canadian natural gas, alternatives to Russian coal, well, that's a win-win-win. It's a win for the economy. It's a win for the environment. But most importantly, it's a win for the preservation of a democratic, free, rules-based world that I think all of us are so deeply concerned about passing on to our children and grandchildren. And this is why the conversations we have around what, in particular, our response in the case of Ukraine should be are so important. And I've certainly met with a number of ambassadors who have highlighted the energy security issue as well. It's an issue throughout Europe, different for different countries. In some cases, for instance, I know in the case of Poland, Poland produces a lot of coal, and providing Canadian energy, Canadian natural gas as an alternative, providing Canadian technology around carbon capture and storage, the kinds of technologies we're developing, as well as energy export, it doesn't have to be security versus environment. We can think about both at the same time, but we need to move quickly on this energy security dimension. It's something that I would like us to be able to hear witnesses speak to at this committee as well. Now, on another issue with respect to Ukraine, and just something that I think we need to think about and hopefully propose recommendations around, is this proposal for a no-fly zone. It was striking that we had President Zelensky, and it was great that he was able to come and speak to Parliament. And his primary ask was for us to close the sky. And I believe it was Ms. May from the Green Party saying, "I do not support that," and Conservatives presented an alternative proposal that was kind of a modified version of a no-fly zone, but basically other parties, despite declaring solidarity and commitment to standing with the people of Ukraine, didn't engage around the question of that specific proposal, and so it left, I think, maybe a little bit of a dissonant impression where there was an ask that was made of the government, and there still kind of hasn't been at least in that moment, in the context of that debate, the clear response. What Conservative leader Candice Bergen proposed was that we work to establish enforced humanitarian corridors. That a reasonable step we could take that would entail a much reduced risk of further escalation would be to say we are going to enforce and defend humanitarian corridors as an avenue for civilians to be able to be safe and move to safety. We have seen the horrific toll that this has been taken on. This war has taken on Ukrainian civilians, and so is there a role that NATO could play? Is there a role for Canada in terms of putting ideas forward and leading within NATO to say that we should have that established no-fly zone type defense of limited areas of humanitarian corridors, and in the context of some of the negotiations that have been happening, Russian authorities have talked about this, but it hasn't. But there hasn't really been a follow through, and so this is a major challenge that I think this committee needs to hear recommendations on and make recommendations back to Parliament. This is the role, this is the potential of the Foreign Affairs Committee to engage with the immense seriousness of what is in front of us with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and to say, rather than play the PMO-directed political strategy of trying to make every single parliamentary committee, it seems, talk about abortion, let's actually talk about the fact that we have this war happening, and let's zero in on the specific recommendations we can make in response to that war, specific recommendations we can make around lethal weapons, around energy security, around establishing a no-fly zone and/or having the enforcement of these sorts of humanitarian corridors. I think these are the kinds of recommendations that we could bring forward if, as a committee, we say, hey, we want to work together, we want to do this seriously, we want to set an agenda in a collaborative way, but we want to focus on this critical issue confronting the world, rather than focus on some effort to sort of stir up a domestic controversy. I think we need to also, as a committee, really dig into the shifts in the Putin regime's rhetoric around its strategic positioning. So we shouldn't, in a sense, we should be careful to put too much into what we hear from the Kremlin. We know that there is an effort to push misinformation, to push disinformation, to try to throw us off track in terms of what their intentions are. But it's nonetheless important for us to be aware of and take note of the things that are being said, and to then study what the implications of those things might be. The initial stated reason for the invasion was I'm reluctant to even repeat it because it's so absurd, but it was the denazification, so-called, of Ukraine. Totally ridiculous allegations that were made by the Putin regime, and then the demilitarization. But I think what's important to understand about the initial expressed aspiration or stated aspiration of the regime was that it was related to the entire country. It was expressed in terms of what was happening in all of Ukraine. It was not the articulation of specific regional objectives. And it started with, as everybody knows, with an invasion from all sides, but an effort to strike across the Belarusian border, and hit Kyiv. That failed, and we've seen a shift in some of the rhetoric towards more discussion of a more regional agenda. So what does that mean? I don't think it means that in any sense we should weaken our resolve or our recognition that the threat is to the entire country, but we should also take note of how there is this apparent shifting in position, and it responds, I think, to the intensity that Ukrainians have shown in defending their own sovereignty, the solidarity and strength that they've brought to the table, and also the ability of the rest of the international community to step forward, to speak about what's going on, and to apply pressure in various ways. But I also think we need to be prepared for this to continue. That it's not just going to that the conflict isn't going to just sort of melt away, right? That we need a longer term strategy, and I think that strategy needs to facilitate the maintenance and further escalation of economic sanctions, as well as sanctions targeting individuals that are involved in these acts of aggression. I think we need to recognize that and really escalate the pressure that's on. So, taking note of that, Mr. Chair, in making the case just for the importance of the work that we need to do on Ukraine, I wanted to highlight just a number of instances of really the horrific atrocities that we've seen that have come out of Ukraine. And members have talked at earlier stages in this debate about gender equality, the importance of combating violence against women, and what we are seeing in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just the horrific victimization of women, the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. It's unfathomable, the horror of what we're seeing going on, as members have all agreed, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide being committed. And I want to highlight a number of these stories that I think should bring into sharp focus the work we need to do and only we can do as the Foreign Affairs Committee in responding to this. So this is one story that from the BBC, a recent story about a woman talking about how Russian soldiers raped her and killed her husband. And she details the story, and basically their family lived, she's 50 years old, her name is Anna. She lives in a rural neighborhood outside of Kiev, and when the Russian soldiers came through, she was raped at gunpoint. Her husband was killed, and this is just one story of the violence. There's a picture here that basically they have a wooden cross in the yard that's where they buried her husband, and because now the Russians have sort of pulled out of the area, and it's one story among just many of the kind of just the unrelenting violence that we've seen. Another story that I was able to find, UN told credible claims of sexual violence against children as Russia's war drives a third of Ukrainians from their home. Britain's ambassador to the United Nations said Thursday that there were credible claims Russian forces have committed sexual violence against children in Ukraine. As UN agencies said, Vladimir Putin's invasion had driven more than 6 million people to flee the country. The UN Refugee Agency reported the grim statistic, which combined with the roughly 8 million Ukrainians who have been displaced within their country, means a third of Ukraine's people have been forced from their homes. The war's effect on Ukraine's youth has been particularly devastating, and Britain's UN ambassador said that appeared to extend to sexual violence committed against children by the invading forces. British Ambassador Barbara Woodward cited the UN humanitarian agency said at least 238 children were believed to be among the thousands of civilians killed since Russia launched its war, with 347 more injured. There are credible allegations of sexual violence against children by Russian forces, Woodward added. As others have said, mass displacement has left children exposed to human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Last month, Ukrainian lawmaker Kira Rudyk told CBS News that sexual violence was being used systematically in all the areas that were occupied by Russians. Quote, rape is used as a tool of war in Ukraine to break our spirits, to humiliate us, and to show us that we can be helpless to protect our women and children and their bodies. Kira Rudyk, a member of Ukraine's parliament, told CBS News. It's happening systematically in the occupied territories. So just horrifying to hear about these things happening, and to recognize that it's important for us to recognize the role we have as a committee in trying to combat this. And I think the way we do it is by specifically focusing on how we can support Ukraine to win the ongoing war. Recognizing this use of sexual violence as a tool by occupying forces in all of the parts, according to this testimony, all of the parts of Ukraine that are occupied by Russia, should underline for us just how much of a role we need to play in preventing the further advance of that Russian aggression, in preventing the further occupation of Ukraine, and how we need to prioritize our engagement with this issue ahead of the political agendas that we may be being told should be pushed. That this is the work that we need to do, in saying how can Ukraine win and ensure that that more Ukrainian women and children don't have to live with the lifelong trauma that comes with these kinds of horrible events. I'll just continue this article. At the Security Council on Thursday, UN Children's Agency Deputy Executive Director Omar said children and parents tell us of their living hell, where they are forced to go hungry, drink from muddy puddles, and shelter from constant shelling bombardment, dodging bombs, bullets, and landmines as they fled. He called the war a child protection and child rights crisis. Children in Ukraine have been displaced, hurt, orphaned, or killed, U.S. Deputy UN Ambassador Richard Mills told diplomats. Of the nearly 14 million people forced to flee their homes since the conflict escalated, approximately half are innocent children, children who deserve a chance to live, grow, and thrive, but instead are struggling every day to survive in horrific circumstances. Briefing diplomats at the Security Council, UN Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator Joyce Messiah said civilians, particularly women and children, are paying the heaviest price in the war. Messiah said the situation was deeply worrying in the Luhansk region in eastern Ukraine, industrial heartland of Donbass, where Russia is currently focusing its assault. She said there were an estimated 40,000 people cut off from electricity, water, and gas supplies there alone. The UN Human Rights Council met in a special session in Geneva on Thursday. Meanwhile, where High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet said 1,000 civilian bodies have been found in the Kiev region alone. Some have been killed in hostilities, but others appear to have been summarily executed. These killings of civilians often appeared to be intentional, carried out by snipers and soldiers. Civilians were killed when crossing the road or leaving their shelters to seek food and water. Others were killed as they fled in their vehicles, Bachelet said. CBS News partner network BBC documented one such alleged killing on Thursday. The network obtained video from multiple security cameras around a business outside of Kyiv that appeared to show several Russian soldiers shooting an unarmed civilian security guard in the back and then looting the business. One of the soldiers is seen breaking a security camera with the butt of his rifle, apparently upon realizing that he and his colleagues' actions were being recorded. So that's just really hard information to share and information to think about. But the kinds of atrocities that we are seeing in Ukraine are horrifying, are unfathomable, and they require the committee to, I think, urgently grab hold of this issue, and as part of its broader agenda, look at the issues of the atrocities that are going on. I want to share from this story in the New York Times. Clear patterns of Russian rights abuses found in Ukraine. Reports say investigators from almost a dozen countries combed bombed-out towns and freshly dug graves in Ukraine on Wednesday for evidence of war crimes, and a wide-ranging investigation by an international security organization detailed what it said were clear patterns of human rights violations by Russian forces. Some of the atrocities may constitute war crimes, said investigators from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, who examined myriad reports of rapes, abductions, and attacks on civilian targets, as well as the use of banned munitions. On Wednesday, civilians were still bearing much of the brunt of the 7-week-old invasion, as Russian forces, massing for an assault in the east, bombarded Ukraine's second-largest city, Kharkiv, striking an apartment building. In an hour-long phone call with Vladimir Zelensky, Ukraine's leader, President Biden said the United States, already a major provider of defensive armaments to Ukraine, would send an additional $800 million in military and other security aid. The package will include new capabilities tailored to the wider assault we expect Russia to launch in eastern Ukraine. I'll just skip down a little bit in the article to say an international criminal court investigation into possible war crimes has been underway since last month, and a number of countries have been looking at ways for the United Nations to help create a special court that could prosecute Russia for what is known as the crime of aggression. Other possibilities include trying Russians in the courts of other nations under the principle of universal jurisdiction, the legal concept that some crimes are so egregious that they can be prosecuted anywhere. I note as well, and members may be interested to know this, that the Subcommittee on International Human Rights is doing a study specifically on the issue of violations of international law and mechanisms by which there could be prosecution for those violations. And I know some members of this committee are members of that committee, and I think that's important study work as well. Ironically, the same thing is happening at SDIR as is happening here, it seems, which is, and I'm not sure what deliberations have happened in public or not, but just jumping off what was said publicly here by Ms. McPherson, that in the midst of this study on human rights violations and atrocities being committed in Ukraine, there's an attempt to shift the agenda to a discussion about abortion. So actually, we have similar things happening here as
Point
an
of order,
SDIR,
Mr. Chair.
where
I pause you there for one moment, Mr. Genuis. Ms. McPherson?
That is actually not accurate. So I would just like to correct
For the-
that. In
for the
fact,
purposes,
the
I'll
motion
take-
that was brought forward in the House of Commons International Subcommittee on International Human Rights was to look at reproductive rights around the world. And in fact, Mr. Genius's colleague asked for a study on the preborn rather than look at the rights of women around the world.
I'll allow that clarification. Thank you very much, Mr. Genuis. Back to you.
all right. Well, I'll let my colleague speak for himself in terms of his proposals around that. I mean, my understanding was that the Subcommittee on International Human Rights was doing a study specifically on the situation in Ukraine and around international human rights as they relate to that. But I can at least, it's fair to say, speak with the most authority on what's happening here at the Foreign Affairs Committee, which is that we are in the process of doing a study on the issue of Ukraine. And there are many issues that need to be, I think, further discussed, further considered. We are in the midst of that study that's happening here, and we could be pursuing that study. And there are many issues that I've mentioned, issues around lethal weapons, around energy security, around kind of humanitarian corridors, no-fly zones, issues around kind of the shifting Russian strategic position. I think, and it is an issue for the Foreign Affairs Committee as well, but just the engagement we do around questions of refugees. This is another issue that has I think not been sufficiently discussed at this committee, and it's been taken up to some extent at the Immigration Committee. I suspect there'll be an abortion motion there too, without delay. But the issue of refugees coming out of Ukraine and how Canada engages and collaborates with other countries in the region in supporting them is, I think, a very important issue, because all of the opposition parties, actually on this point, have been united in saying there should be visa-free travel for those who are coming out of Ukraine, and recognizing that visa-free travel is part of the framework that exists in other countries in the vicinity. The government of Canada says, we couldn't do it, and they've kind of vacillated in terms of their explanations, saying on some days they say, well, it'd be a potential security issue, but then at other times saying, well, it would take too long to put it in place, or it's too complicated, it's too onerous to make that kind of change in our immigration rules. Well, it seems that these things take far longer than they should. And when other countries are able to lift their visa requirements, and you think of how much is being done by Poland, by Lithuania, by Latvia, by Estonia, by Romania, by all of the countries in the region who are accepting refugees without requiring a visa, and Canada, given our vastness, the way that I think Canadians feel about this conflict and their desire to play an important role in helping support those that are suffering as a result of this conflict, I think there would be just an immense desire for Canadians to be able to play more of that role, and yet we see the government through their immigration policies saying no to visa-free travel. So that's another issue that I think we need to take up, is how, in our engagement with this conflict, what are we doing to help those who are impacted by it? And of course, there's the refugee side of it, and there's also the humanitarian support. And we have called for that humanitarian support. We've been, as we've said on a number of issues, we've been supportive of the steps that the government has taken to date. But we've also called on the government to make improvements in certain respects. There was one issue that I raised in the House that I think would merit further attention here at this committee, and that is the question of how the government approaches matching programs. Right out of the gate, the government announced that they were going to do a matching program, and that matching program would only apply to the Red Cross. And Canadians were so generous that the allotment the federal government was prepared to match filled up right away.
I apologize, Mr. Tenuous. We've got a point of order. Let's go to Ms.
Mr.
McPherson.
Chair, I'm relatively a new parliamentarian, so perhaps this isn't a point of order, but I did just want to check if there was any need for gender parity as we discuss women's rights, or if we will be listening to a man speak about the rights of women for the next several hours. I'm wondering as well if we would be interested in hearing from some of the female members of this committee on the reproductive rights of women.
I don't believe that that's a point of order.
Can I speak to the point of order? I don't think I've ever disclosed my gender to this committee. So,
Mr. Genius, thank you for that. But irrespective of that, I don't believe it is a point of order. It may be part of the emerging dynamic this afternoon, and members are certainly welcome to challenge that in subsequent interventions. And back to you, Mr. Genius.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that was an interesting intervention by my colleague. With all due respect, I mean, when an issue is brought to a committee that I happen to be a member of, and that
see a bell ringing. Was that? Do we have a vote happening?
Okay, let's see what bell we have. Is it a 30-minute or 15?
And you would need unanimous consent to consider. I don't believe you will find unanimous consent at this time.
Oh. It's a 30-minute bell, and as you say, Mr. Oliphant, we need unanimous consent. We have a practice of going 15 minutes in, but we need UC from the point of the bell. Is there unanimous consent to continue for an additional 15
Mr. Chair,
minutes?
just on a point of order, is there a will for the committee to adjourn or to suspend?
There's two interventions at the same time. There's no unanimous consent. Let's hold that thought, Mr. Jennings.
The meeting is
question?
adjourned at that point.
Question
Is the meeting adjourned then? I'm just looking for
There's
clarity.
no unanimous consent. It would be suspended until.
We are over the allotted time. So, is there a will to adjourn or?
No. My understanding is that we have until 5:50. So if the vote is going to take us, it's going to be a half an hour bell plus a 10-minute vote plus 10 minutes of confirmation. So we will be more or less at 5:50, which is our full 2-hour allotment. So
Suspend.
okay, we've got there's no UC. So my question is, what is the default conclusion
Standing order requires you to suspend now.
that we suspend, not adjourn?
Well, Mr. Chair, point of order. If the committee is agreeable, I would suggest that we adjourn, which will then allow us to continue our regular meeting on Thursday on Taiwan, which is what I believe we have scheduled. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
Because if we suspend, the meeting with respect to Taiwan will be canceled, I assume. And
Be superseded in the short
in
term,
lieu
yes.
of that meeting, we will have a meeting on this motion that we are presently debating. So my suggestion
Yes.
is that we adjourn so that we can actually get back to Taiwan.
We have to make sure that we're procedurally on solid
Yeah.
ground because we did
So-
not get UC to continue, which really technically means that we are suspended as of the time of
Unless
Mr.
there's
Olson
an
having.
agreement from the committee to adjourn,
Right, so
in which
let's-
case we could do Taiwan on Thursday.
there seems to be not, at least not unanimous agreement, so we are suspended until our next session, which is Thursday.
I'll send an email.
Okay, until we are advised by email. Thank you, colleagues.
you.